The wind had teeth that night, cold, sharp, and unforgiving. The kind of storm that made even the coyotes go quiet and forced ranchers to lock every door, every gate, every thought that dared wander too far. But through the sheets of rain and the roar of thunder, he saw her. A girl no older than 16, barefoot, soaked to the bone, and wrapped in nothing but a white dress that clung to her like desperation itself. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, staring through the storm as if she belonged to something far older than the land. Clayton Reeves wasn't a man given to kindness. Not anymore. Years in the saddle, loss in every wrinkle on his face, and enough ghosts behind him to fill a graveyard. But something in the way she stood, silent, proud, untouched by fear, made him open that door, made him defy the logic of a hard land and let her step inside. And the moment he did, the storm changed. Not louder, not calmer, just different, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath. She didn't say where she came from, didn't eat much, barely slept, but she watched everything, the horses, the rifles, the sky. And each night, after the lamps were dimmed, Clayton would find her standing by the window, whispering words in a language he'd never heard but felt in his chest like the beat of an old drum. And then it began. At first, it was just shadows near the tree line, then footprints, then fire. Within days, they started arriving, tribes that hadn't walked that valley in decades. Unannounced, unarmed, but very, very present. They brought no threats, no offerings, just eyes that studied the house with reverence, and sometimes a strange kind of grief. Elders, warriors, mothers with babies tied to their backs, all of them silent, as if summoned. As if the girl in white was not a stranger, but a signal. Clayton tried to ask her who she really was, but her answers never came in words. Just glances, just stillness. And the more he tried to understand, the more he realized this wasn't about charity. It was about destiny. Because in the West, some storms don't pass. They change everything they touch. And sometimes, the choice to open a door, to show mercy once, can awaken forces buried deep beneath blood, soil, and memory. The girl in white didn't bring the rain. She brought the reckoning. And by the time Clayton realized what he had let inside, it was far too late to turn back. The tribes were already here, and they weren't leaving. The next morning, Clayton stood on the porch, mug in hand, staring into the fog that hung low across the valley. He hadn't slept much. Something about that girl unsettled the air around her, not in a threatening way, but like a memory you couldn't place, yet couldn't shake. She sat by the hearth now, hair still damp from the storm, staring into the flames as if they whispered only to her. She hadn't spoken since she arrived, but her silence was louder than any scream. Clayton, hardened by years and war, couldn't find it in himself to send her away. By midday, the first rider appeared, a figure wrapped in furs and feathers, painted face glistening under the sun. He didn't speak either, only looked at the house, at the girl inside, and then turned his horse back toward the hills. Clayton followed his tracks for over a mile, but they vanished like dust and wind. When he returned, she was still by the fire, humming a song with no words, her eyes half closed, like she could see far beyond the walls of that ranch. That night, he bolted the doors, not from fear, but from uncertainty. Whatever was coming, it wasn't ordinary. The ranch hadn't seen visitors in months. Clayton liked it that way. Solitude was simpler than trust. But by the third day, 2 more riders came. This time, they approached slowly, heads lowered, hands empty. They stood at a distance, not close enough to threaten, but close enough to be seen. One of them, an older man with silver braids, knelt and placed something in the dirt, a carved stone in the shape of a hawk. Then they left without a word. Clayton picked up the stone, felt its weight, its warmth, and something inside him stirred, something ancestral. That evening, he found the girl in the barn, standing among the horses. The animals didn't flinch near her, didn't shy away like they usually did around strangers. In fact, they seemed calmer. She was brushing the flank of his oldest mare, whispering in that same foreign tongue. Clayton leaned against the post, arms crossed. "They're not just passing through, are they?" he asked. She turned, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were pale, almost glowing. They were waiting, she said softly. And now they've come. He didn't sleep at all that night. The girl's voice echoed in his head. They were waiting. For her. For something she carried. For the storm that hadn't passed. Only changed shape? Clayton didn't know. But the next morning, when he stepped out onto the porch, there were 3 fires burning on the distant ridge. Not wildfires. Signal fires. Controlled. Intentional. Lit with purpose. The land was speaking. Not in words, but in flames. And whatever it was saying, it was only beginning. The following days brought more than riders. They brought drums, slow, rhythmic, patient. Clayton could hear them in the distance, steady as a heartbeat, always at dusk. The girl said little, but her presence deepened. She moved through the ranch like she belonged to it, like her roots reached deeper than his own. The cattle didn't spook, the winds softened, and the very air felt heavier, not in threat, but in meaning. Something sacred had settled on the land, and Clayton, for the first time in years, felt like a guest on his own soil. By the 7th day, the valley below the ranch had changed. Tents rose in the tall grass. Not makeshift camps, but ceremonial structures. People moved with purpose, setting fires, painting stones, hanging talismans from trees. They didn't speak to Clayton, but they didn't ignore him either. They acknowledged him with nods, quiet respect, as if he'd been chosen for a role he didn't understand. He rode down once, tried to ask questions, but no one answered. They simply looked at the girl, then back at him, and waited. She began preparing meals in strange ways, using herbs he didn't grow, whispering to the fire before cooking. He caught her placing small items beneath the porch steps, inside the barn, even beneath his bed. Bones, feathers, folded bits of cloth. When he confronted her, she looked at him with calm certainty. Protection, she said, for when the others come. What others? He asked. She didn't reply. But that night, he dreamed of fire, of faces in the smoke, of warriors walking through his fields without leaving footprints. One afternoon, an elder approached the ranch alone, a woman with deep-set eyes and hands like worn leather. She asked to speak with the girl. They sat beneath the old oak for hours, speaking in that ancient tongue. When she left, she handed Clayton a pouch. Inside was ash, red earth, and a stone etched with a symbol he didn't recognize. Keep it near the door, the woman said. Your blood is not her blood, but your heart is now tied to her fate. He didn't understand, but something in her voice made him obey. And then, without warning, the animals began to behave differently. Coyotes no longer howled near the ranch. Birds gathered in clusters and sat silently on the fences. His dog, once fearless, refused to cross the barn threshold where the girl often sat. And late one night, Clayton heard a whisper through the floorboards, not from outside, but from beneath the house itself. It was then he realized this wasn't about who the girl was. It was about what had followed her. And soon, the land would have to decide if it would hold or break under the weight of what was coming. The night sky stretched wide over the valley like a black canvas, painted with stars. But even the constellations seemed to shift, unsettled. Clayton stood by the window, eyes fixed on the distant fires that now numbered more than a dozen. Every ridge, every hill around the ranch flickered with light, not hostile, but watching. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor behind him, placing stones in a pattern he didn't recognize. They're not here for me, she said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. They're here because of what's waking beneath the ground. Clayton turned, chilled. You mean people? She shook her head slowly. Something older. Something that remembers when men still listened to the land. He wanted to laugh it off, blame her words on stories and superstition. But his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through ambushes, cattle raids, and winters that killed stronger men, told him to listen. The West had never been just dirt and dust. It had memory. It had laws deeper than guns and governments. And now, those laws were stirring. The next morning, the sky turned the color of rust. Dust clouds rolled in without wind, and the birds, all of them, vanished. Not a single caw or flutter echoed across the ranch. The girl lit a fire outside and circled it with salt and ash. Clayton watched from the porch, shotgun in hand, unsure if it would be useful against whatever might come. She began to chant, low, ancient syllables that seemed to make the air itself tremble. And then the first tremor hit. Just a rumble, like distant thunder underground. By noon, the earth cracked in one of the far pastures. No quake, no collapse, just a long, narrow fissure that bled steam and the scent of something bitter and old. Clayton rode out, stared down into the split, and saw nothing but blackness. When he turned back, he found 3 figures waiting near the barn, tribal elders, dressed not for war, but for burial. They didn't greet him. They didn't ask permission. They began drawing symbols in the dirt, praying in a language that felt older than any god Clayton had ever heard of. That night, the girl did not sleep. Neither did the tribes. Fires burned across every ridge. Drums echoed through the trees like a slow heartbeat. And in the center of it all, the ranch glowed faintly with circles of stone, salt, and bone, a barrier, a warning, or maybe an invitation. Clayton lay in bed, awake, shotgun on his chest, staring at the ceiling as the girl's chant rose and fell in rhythm with the wind. The storm had passed, yes, but the true reckoning had only just begun. The valley woke up wrong. The air was too still, as if the sky was holding its breath. Even the cattle sensed it, refusing to graze, bunching near the fence lines, eyes wide and unblinking. Clayton rode the perimeter at dawn and found tracks too large for any horse, too wide for any man. Hoof-like but deep, they circled the ranch once, then vanished. No path in, no path out, only the mark of something that did not belong. And somehow, the girl knew. She stood at the gate when he returned, her face unreadable. "It's here," she said. Clayton didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. Some truths announced themselves without explanation. All that day, the tribes gathered closer. Elders with painted faces, children wrapped in prayer cloths, warriors with eyes that saw beyond the physical. No one spoke. No one moved without purpose. The girl walked among them like a ghost returned home, placing her hands on their shoulders, whispering things that brought tears or resolve. Clayton watched it all like a man trapped in a dream he didn't understand, yet couldn't wake from. As night fell, the air turned cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from altitude or wind, but the kind that lives in deep caves, where light has never touched. The girl drew a wide circle in front of the house and placed herself at the center. "This land was wounded long before you came," she told Clayton. "What comes tonight will either heal it or finish what was started generations ago." He asked her if there was anything he could do. She looked at him with something close to affection. "You already did it. You opened the door." When the first howl tore through the trees, it didn't sound like any wolf Clayton had ever heard. It was deeper, layered, like voices overlapping in a single, terrible sound. The tribe tightened their circle, torches flaring to life. The drums began again, faster now, urgent. And from the woods, the shadows moved. Not people, not beasts, shapes, things born of pain, of old violence buried beneath the soil of forgotten battles. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were waiting for something, for someone. And then the girl in white stood, no longer small, no longer frail. Her voice rose above the wind, above the drums, above the fear in every chest. She wasn't calling out in panic. She was commanding. She raised her arms, light pouring from the markings on her skin, and the creatures in the forest stopped, frozen. The fire surged, the earth shook, and Clayton, heart pounding, realized the truth he'd been circling since the night she arrived. The girl hadn't come to escape something. She was what everything else was running from, or toward. And now, no one, not man, not spirit, not tribe, would leave unchanged. The flames along the ridge roared higher, turning the valley into a bowl of flickering light and shadow. The figures in the woods, those twisted shapes born of old pain and ancient wrath, stood just outside the reach of the fire, watching, waiting. Their presence was like the weight of thunderclouds before a storm, oppressive and alive. Clayton gripped his rifle tighter, though a part of him knew it was as useless now as words. This wasn't a fight he could win with lead. This was something older, something sacred, something earned. The girl's voice filled the air, not in fear, but in fury. Her chants, once soft and mysterious, now echoed like war cries laced with sorrow. Her white dress whipped around her legs like smoke, her eyes glowing with light not of this world. As she raised her arms, the earth beneath her cracked, revealing a dull red glow from the depths below. But it wasn't fire. It was memory. Blood spilled long ago, battles erased from the history of men, but carved into the bones of the land itself. One of the creatures stepped forward, massive and silent, its form shifting like smoke in wind. It wasn't human, but it wore pieces of human pain, faces, voices, echoes. The tribe held their line, unmoving, but Clayton could feel their fear. Even warriors born into struggle trembled before this. But the girl did not. She walked straight to the edge of the light and whispered something only the beast could hear. It lowered its head, not in surrender, in recognition, as if her voice unlocked a name it had forgotten. Then she turned and spoke for all to hear. These are not demons. They are what we left behind. The grief of children buried without names. The screams of villages erased by greed. The silence of truth never told. Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. They have come to be remembered, to be seen. And if we do not face them now, they will never leave this land. It wasn't a curse. It was a warning, and it belonged to everyone. Clayton stepped forward. He didn't understand it all. Not the language, not the creatures, not the glowing earth or the girl's power. But he understood regret. He understood what it meant to bury things you never wanted to face. Then we see them, he said, voice firm, rifle lowered. We see them all. And in that moment, something shifted. The wind stopped. The shadows hesitated. And deep in the valley, beneath fire and soil, something began to release its grip, not out of fear, but out of peace. The girl knelt and placed her palm on the soil. The red glow beneath the earth dimmed, turning gold, like embers losing their rage. Around her, the creatures began to retreat, not fleeing, but dissolving, folding back into the mist as if returning to where they came. Some wept without tears, voices carried in the wind. Others simply bowed their heads and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a trace of warmth in the cold ground. The drums stopped. The forest sighed. The land, after so long, exhaled. The elders gathered around the girl, laying small totems at her feet, offerings not of worship, but of gratitude. She had not summoned war. She had summoned memory. And in remembering, the land was finally able to heal. Clayton stood back, unsure of his place in it all. He had fired no shot, had drawn no blade. But still, they looked at him, as if he mattered. As if opening his door had changed not just the fate of the girl, but the fate of the valley itself. One of the elders approached him, the same woman who had given him the stone. She touched his chest with 2 fingers and whispered, "You broke the chain." He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, because deep down, he understood. The West was never just about cowboys and outlaws. It was about choices made in silence, and the courage to do right when no one was watching. That night, he had chosen to open a door, and now, generations of silence had been broken. The girl remained on the ranch, but she was no longer just a girl in white. She became something else, a guardian, a symbol, a living story. She spoke rarely, smiled more often, and when she walked through the fields, the grass seemed to lean toward her. Children from the tribes came to learn from her. Travelers left tokens at the edge of the property. Even the storms changed, softer now, as if the sky itself had found peace. Clayton rebuilt the barn, repaired the fences, and in every nail he drove, he felt something deeper settle into the bones of the place. And so the West remembered, not through books or monuments, but through wind, fire, and the footsteps of a girl who once stood in the storm. The kind of story that doesn't fade, because it was never just a story. It was truth. And truth, in the West, always finds a way to rise. As weeks passed, the ranch transformed into something more than land and fences. It became sacred ground, not because of the soil, nor the cattle that grazed upon it, but because of the silence that now sang with meaning. Travelers from distant ridges came on foot, bringing tokens, not out of obligation, but reverence. Medicine men whispered blessings near the well. Mothers buried tiny charms beneath the oak tree where the girl often sat. And the girl, still dressed in white, remained still, yet ever present, like the spirit of the valley itself. Clayton Reeves, Once a man who trusted only the weight of his rifle and the width of his land, found himself changing in ways he couldn't name. He didn't speak as much. He listened more, not just to people, but to the wind, the creak of the barn, the way the horses pawed the dirt. The girl had taught him without teaching. She never lectured, never demanded. She simply was. A mirror to the land, showing him truths buried beneath years of dust and regret. One day, a young warrior named Elon arrived, strong, proud, carrying both a spear and question. He asked the girl what made the ranch sacred. She pointed not to the altar of stones by the porch, not to the scarred field where spirits once stood, but to Clayton. Because he chose to see, she said. The boy didn't understand at first, but that night, he sat beside the fire with Clayton, asking him about his past, about what he had lost, and why he had let a stranger in during the storm. Clayton stared at the flames a long time before answering. Because she looked like the truth, and I'd spent too long avoiding it. The past, they say, never stays buried. But sometimes, it doesn't return to haunt. It returns to heal. That's what the tribes believe now. That the girl in white had not arrived by accident. That she had been guided to the one man who would not chain her, question her, or weaponize her. And in that choice, in that door opening on a storm-soaked night, the land had shifted. Not just the earth, but the soul of the West itself. A wound had closed, and yet, the valley still held its breath. Not in fear, but in reverence. Because even in peace, there are echoes. And what happened on that land had not only changed the future, it had awakened the past. The kind of awakening that draws more than just memory, it draws destiny. And Clayton, though older, though worn, knew it in his bones. They were not done. Not yet. It was during the harvest moon that the sky turned strange again. Not with darkness, but with light so pale and wide it made the entire valley glow silver. The girl stood at the ridge, her face lifted to the heavens, and behind her, shadows began to gather once more. But they weren't the same shadows that had come before. These were quieter, gentler, like echoes of something long gone, asking to be remembered one last time. The tribes gathered again, this time not with weapons or chants of war, but with music, flutes, rattles, soft drums that mimicked the rhythm of heartbeat and hoof. The ceremony was not planned, yet everyone moved in harmony. Ayana, the name the girl now carried, whispered in her ear by the wind one morning, walked barefoot across the field, stopping at each fire circle to receive a prayer, a touch, a tear. Clayton followed at a distance, unsure of his place, but unwilling to let her walk alone. She paused before the barn, the very place she had whispered to the horses, where the earth first began to tremble. There, she knelt, placed both palms on the dirt, and closed her eyes. And something rose from the ground, not a figure, not a flame, but a feeling, a collective breath, a story unspoken but felt in every heart. The spirits that once wandered angry were now at rest. But in their place, something new remained, something rooted, watching, waiting. An elder approached Clayton, placing a hand on his shoulder. She did not come to be protected, he said. She came to see if we were ready to remember. Clayton looked at the girl, bathed in moonlight, still and strong. And were we? He asked. The elder smiled faintly. Some of us were. Some will follow. But the land remembers who listens. And with that, he turned, leaving Clayton alone with the weight of something he couldn't quite name. The valley would never be what it once was, but it would never be forgotten again. The girl in white, the tribes who answered, the man who opened his door, they had written something into the soil that no drought, no bullet, no time could erase. And as the fires burned low and the moon dipped behind the ridge, the West, wild, wounded, eternal, whispered its thanks in wind and silence. Autumn fell gently over the valley, but the land no longer carried the same silence. It breathed now, not just with wind and rustling leaves, but with memory. Children of the tribe played near the creek, their laughter echoing off the rocks like songs the land had longed to hear again. Elders gathered in the evenings beneath the oak, telling stories that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. And Ayana, once a girl alone in the storm, now walked the fields like a keeper of sacred things, not revered like a saint, but trusted like a river that never ran dry. Clayton had changed too. His hands still bore the calluses of a rancher, but his eyes carried something new. Softness, yes, but strength of a different kind. The kind that came not from holding back the world, but from letting it in. He no longer watched the ridges in fear. He no longer questioned the strange quiet of the horses or the sudden stillness before dusk. He had learned, slowly, that some things aren't meant to be explained, only respected. One night, as the first frost kissed the grass, Ayanna sat with Clayton by the fire. She told him the names of stars he'd never known, stories of rivers that once ran red, of songs sung beneath the earth by those who had no graves. He listened without interrupting, the firelight dancing in his weathered face. And when she was done, she looked at him not as a messenger, not as a stranger, but as someone who had become part of the very story he thought he was merely witnessing. A letter arrived days later, brought by a courier from a distant fort, a government document, stamped and sealed, demanding land rights, questioning tribal presence, threatening removal. Clayton read it once, then tossed it into the fire. He didn't speak of it again. Some things, he had come to understand, couldn't be reasoned with. But they could be defied, not with violence, with presence, with roots, with unshakable stillness. That land belonged to those who remembered it, and memory now had weight. And so, the valley endured, not as it had been, but as it was always meant to be, a place where the past wasn't buried, but honored. A place where a rancher, a girl in white, and the echo of tribes' long silence stood together, not in war, but in remembrance. And in that memory, something greater than survival was born. Legacy. Winter arrived with silence thick as snow. The fields lay still, blanketed in frost, and the mountains watched over the valley like ancient sentinels. The ranch didn't buzz with fear anymore. It pulsed with something steady, grounded. Fires burned slower, but warmer. Songs were sung not to keep spirits away, but to welcome them home. And every night, Ayanna placed a new stone by the oak, each one marked with a symbol, a memory, a name returned to the earth. Clayton no longer asked questions. He simply lived, present, alert, reverent. He mended fences not to keep the world out, but to show the land he was still there, still listening. Sometimes he would ride to the ridge, watch the stars appear one by one, and speak aloud to no one. To his father, to his younger self, to the storm that had brought her. And though no one ever answered, he always felt heard. One evening, a stranger came, a young man with worn boots and a rifle too clean for a real fight. He asked about the girl in white, asked if the stories were true. Clayton didn't answer right away. He simply pointed to the valley, to the trees, to the circle of stones glowing faintly beneath the snow. Truth don't always come in words, he said. Sometimes, it walks right through your front gate during a storm and never leaves. The young man stayed for the night, but by morning, he was gone. And the story grew. Years passed, and still, the ranch stood. The trees grew taller. The river ran clearer. And the land remembered. It remembered the blood, the silence, the scream buried in dust. But it also remembered the door that opened, the arms that didn't turn away, the fire that was never meant to destroy, only to cleanse. Ayanna remained, though she seemed to age slower than time itself. And Clayton? He grew old not with sorrow, but with purpose. A witness, a guardian, a man who chose to believe. And so the West, for all its wild, kept that story close, of a girl in white, a man with a quiet heart, and a valley that became something more. Something sacred. Because some storms don't break you. They make you. And sometimes, all it takes to change the course of history is one open door. Some stories are too big for words and too true to fade with time. What happened in that valley wasn't just about one girl or one man. It was about what happens when someone dares to listen to the land, to the silence, to the pain that history tries to bury. Clayton Reeves didn't become a legend through war or fame. He became one by opening his door when no one else would. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One door, one act of faith, to change the course of everything. Ayanna never asked for praise. She didn't demand loyalty. But through her presence, she awakened what generations had silenced. Her story wasn't one of magic. It was one of memory. And in the West, memory is sacred. It holds the weight of every voice that was lost, every truth that was buried beneath years of dust and denial. That's what makes this story powerful. Not the fire or the fear, but the choice to remember. This wasn't a tale of heroes or villains. It was a story of reckoning, of land reclaiming its voice, of spirits demanding to be seen, and of a man finally realizing that strength doesn't come from the size of your land, but from how far you're willing to open your heart. Clayton didn't save the valley. He simply stepped aside long enough for truth to take root. And in that silence, something eternal began to grow. So when you remember this story, don't think only of the girl in white, or the drums on the ridge, or the creatures at the edge of the woods. Think of the door, the one that stood between fear and faith, the one that opened when the storm was strongest. Because maybe, just maybe, we all have a door like that. And the next time the wind howls and something knocks, you'll know what to do. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you remember, reflect, or feel something deeper than words, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who still believes in the power of the land, the spirit, and the choice to open the door. Because the West isn't gone. It just needs someone to keep telling its stories.